Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Stephanie, for opening us up in Lamentation worship. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion and actually a discussion amongst all of us because we want this to be interactive, called Lamentation as Pedagogy. Lamentation as a teaching tool, as pedagogy. And I will explain to you momentarily what that is all about. But my name is Danjuma Gibson. I teach pastoral theology and pastoral care here at Calvin Theological Seminary. And I am honored and just so elated that my colleagues are joining me here. They've come all the way from Texas and Buffalo, New York to be here to bless us today. Here on my right, your left, is Dr. Rolanda Ward. Dr. Rolanda Ward is from Niagara University, and Dr. Ward is the Associate Professor of Social Work at Niagara University. She is also the Director of the Vincentian Scholars Program, and she is the endowed faculty director of the Center for Race, Equity, and Mission at Niagara University. And so help me bless Dr. Ward this afternoon. Thank you for being here. And then last but not least, here is my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Boddie. Dr. Boddie is the Assistant Professor of Church and Community Ministries at Baylor University. And Dr. Boddie has actually 3 appointments across various departments at Baylor University. She is a professor in the Diana Garland School of Social Work, and then she's also a professor at the George Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor. And then she's also a professor there in their School of Education. If you can help me bless Dr. Boddie. And so what you are doing here today, you are actually intersecting with us in the middle of a year-long, at least a year-long research project that we have entitled Lamentation as Pedagogy. This is a research project funded by ATS, the Association for Theological Schools, that accredits a good number, the vast majority, I believe, of seminaries in North America. And so I'll just share with you a brief description of this project, let you know where we are at this point, where we're headed, and then I'll open up the panel for discussions and for questions, and then we'll also interact with you as well. This really grows out of our concern for what we believe is a desensitization to violence that we see, mass violence, public violence against Black and brown bodies. And what's interesting about this project, when we think we've reached a point where we can stake our research, then something else happens. But in particular, we were interested in 3 areas where we were doing our qualitative research. One would be understanding how the community in Buffalo, New York, the community around the Tops grocery store massacre, where I believe there were 10 Black individuals who were massacred about a year and a half ago there in Buffalo, New York. And so we will be coming up soon in March. We will be there doing research as to how that community is engaging in lamentation. Later on this year, we will be visiting individuals at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And you remember that several years ago, where an individual walked in and massacred about 9 or 10 individuals in the midst of Bible study. But our concern just doesn't stop there. I would add to that what we've all just recently witnessed, whether that was the very public execution of a George Floyd, and then most recently, a very public execution of Tyree Nichols down in Memphis. I was on a panel this morning and someone asked about that, and my reaction was, I've been on this earth for 49 years, and when I saw Tyree Nichols being murdered, what crossed my mind was that was probably the closest image I got to, I wondered, is this how the soldiers beat Jesus the night before his execution? Is this perhaps the closest image in my life that I am witnessing as to what that could have been like? But as theological educators, we are concerned about the absence, what we feel is an absence in theological education to foster a conversation, a sustained conversation around this sort of radical evil that we are witnessing. And so in this research project, taking students with us, we are researching, we're trying to understand how is it where if students are taken out of the classroom and they are put physically in these places, how then do we talk about and understand and hear theology, practical theology, systematic theology? How do students being there in Buffalo, New York, at the site of the Tops grocery store massacre, how does that impact the theological imagination, the Christian imagination, in a way that it cannot in a sanitized classroom, in a very safe classroom? Those are the sorts of questions that we are asking. And so this project began with taking students from, a few students from Calvin Seminary, a few students from Baylor University, and the vast majority of the students were from Niagara University, and the vast majority of the students from Baylor. We began this research project in Washington, D.C. in October, where we visited the new African American Museum of History and Culture, again, asking the same question: if you are in a physical presence of various images and symbols of massacre and lamentation, how does that then impact the Christian imagination? And so that is where you are joining us, and I will bring my colleagues into this conversation now. Just simply, I'll start with you, Rolanda. Why is it that you want to teach lamentation as a pedagogy?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to share where we are in this journey in our work. So I am from Buffalo, and I'm not sure if many of you know Buffalo, New York, and how it's constructed. But it is a place where segregation still has deep roots. Our neighborhoods are divided by race, not just income, but by race. People stay on certain parts of the city. And when the massacre happened, although it was shocking to a lot of people, it made sense that he chose the Tops because it was segregated. And so when I think about what is my role as an educator, so I'm a social worker by profession, dipped my toes in theology because I have an MDiv. I really sat and just thought to myself, how can we grieve the fact that somebody knew where to come, right? How do we start with that? Yes, we lost bodies. Yes, we lost some family members and community members who were entrenched in Buffalo, New York. But how do we grieve ourselves as humanity that we allow this condition to persist? And so, when we think about our role in the church and our understanding of who God is and what God calls us into, one of the things as a social worker that I push quite heavily in my classes is this understanding of, are we conscious to the things that oppress us? And in the church, do we spend time having conversations about what we don't know regarding oppression? And so, I'm particularly called to this space of making sure that those of us who walks that are outside of a TOPS, we don't go to those neighborhoods, right? In fact, we say words like sketchy, dangerous, right? Make sure you're out of there by a certain time. Essentially, as community members of faith, right, that means that we are not conscious to the experiences that others have. And if we're not conscious to those experiences, then how will we do God's work? So I think that's why this sits with me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Stephanie, why teach Lamentation as a pedagogy for you?
For me, I teach Lamentation as a pedagogy because after the protest of 2020, several of our students were really upset about not just the killing of George Floyd. They were most wanting to talk to faculty because they were upset that no faculty had spoken to them. And I'm in Texas. So we had a student, in fact, that knew the family of George Floyd. And so those students were particularly upset that there had not yet been some space created for students to talk about their pain, their loss, their grief. And so an opportunity was created for the students once it was apparent that this was something they really wanted. And some of the students were very ready to have these conversations, but what we learned was that there were many students that were not prepared for this conversation because they had been socialized in their faith communities that you don't complain. And they saw bringing this to the faculty and saying, we felt hurt that there had not been a conversation with us as a complaint, because after all, they loved their faculty. There's so many good things that they felt like they were experiencing, and to bring this would feel like an unholy complaint. So there were a few of us that went to the students and really tried to explain to them that to hold on to this pain and not to express it might cause further harm to them. And this was important for us to share this with these students because Waco is already a city that's known for trauma. Many of you probably know Waco because of Magnolia and all the wonderful things that you hear about Fixer Upper, but there's a whole generation that know Waco because of the Branch Davidians. But there's another generation that know Waco because of the Jesse Washington lynching. How many of you know about the Jesse Washington lynching? Well, at the beginning of the 1900s, a 17-year-old boy was accused of killing a white woman. He was cognitively impaired, so he wasn't really fully able to be on trial, but he was on trial, and he was basically taken from the courthouse, dragged throughout the city, and brutally killed. And what is most horrific not only was the fact that he was killed so brutally and then burned, but that there were hundreds of people out there watching as if it were a picnic, and that there were pictures taken, and they were sent as postcards. And so Waco has been trying for decades to deal with this tragedy. And there, much like you've heard Buffalo described, Waco is very segregated. And people don't feel comfortable talking about race. They don't feel comfortable talking about the racial violence that is so prevalent in Texas. And I've even had students leave my classroom when there have been attempts made to have such conversations. So when I heard about the opportunity to be a part of this class, I thought that this may be an opportunity to create a brave space for students to be able to talk about the pain that they continue to carry. Not only the pain that they carry from watching this repeatedly on television, but the intergenerational pain that they carry, that their parents carried, that their grandparents carried, and that the unhidden wounds that our students have that they don't even know are there. So this has been a challenging journey, but one that our students were eager to have. When I announced the class, I actually had more students than we had spaces for, and I just couldn't turn the students away because I felt like if they were willing to have this experience, then this would be an opportunity not only for them, but the way the course is set up is that it's not just for them to gain something, but how can they share what they're learning from this experience?
Thank you for that. I think it will be helpful. I'll talk a little bit here about my own answer to this question, why Lamentation is a pedagogy, and perhaps we can take a few moments just to update on what happened in Washington, D.C. and some of our thoughts from there. Why do I think this is important to teach Lamentation as a pedagogy? Just quickly, theologically, I'll start there. The entire gospel turns on the Passion event. We don't have a gospel. We don't have Christian theology, period. Reformed, Presbyterian, no matter Wesleyan, it all turns on the Passion event. The First Testament points towards the Passion event. So I say that in response to perhaps how we like to be happy here in the United States. And when we think of Lamentation, the question then becomes, well, let's not talk about it too much, or we'll talk about it as a topic. No, the gospel turns on the Passion event, and when we think about the Eucharist, Christ makes it clear, if you're going to be a part of me, you'll never forget my murder. We've sacralized forgetting today. He says, you'll never forget my murder. Even in his resurrection, when his disciples couldn't believe that it was him, he could have proven that it was him in any way, but he said, my wounds are still here. He invited them to the grotesque. He said, put your hand in my wound, to one. And so that leads me to believe as a theological educator that we are missing a lot when it comes to the formation of future leaders in the church when we reduce Lamentation to a topic during a week in a 12-week semester. My definition of Lamentation, I think, is important, how we understand it, because it's not just crying. I identify as a pastoral psychotherapist, and one of the things that I believe about lamentation or grief is that this is something God has given us as a preservative to preserve our humanity in the face of great loss. So we grieve to maintain, so we don't rot in the face of evil over our lifetime. Lamentation, then, is the grief work that we engage in to come to terms with what has been lost. And so again, I think I can see theological education going in through that lens. The last thing I will say on this, as an example, when you think about, most individuals, when they think about a personality like Martin Luther King Jr., they only think of civil rights, not realizing that what informed his civil rights was, and the things that he did, he has tens of thousands of theological papers that he has written, tens of thousands that people are not familiar with. So if you go to some events like AAR, American Academy of Religion, you have these guilds, Martin Luther King Guild, where you have King scholars come and talk about that. One of the things that I contend in Martin Luther King's body of work is that it all stemmed from Lamentation. And in this next book that I have coming out, I argue the kitchen event. If you remember, he talks about this kitchen event where he prayed to God to give him strength. This was when he was still at Dexter Avenue, a pastor at Dexter Avenue, and he prays to God to give him strength. You may have read that in his autobiography, have seen that in various movies, and he was shaking. This was after his home was bombed. I argue that he was lamenting, and in that moment, he had to do grief work for the very likelihood of a violent death. And he talks about how the Holy Spirit gave him strength in that moment. Now, I just have to take him at his word. I still haven't quite figured out. I want to know what happened in that kitchen, because quite frankly, I'm jealous of it. But I argue that all of his work after that, we would not have seen it had it not been for that act of lamentation in the kitchen. Teaching here at Calvin Seminary, a predominantly white seminary, I will last say that I believe this is vitally important as we talk about these massacres of black and brown bodies. This is not just about black people. This is vitally important for my white students that I love dearly. They have to understand this as well for their Christian imagination, for all of us, and how we imagine the Christian story. Any thoughts?
I have one. When you describe the wounds of Jesus, one of the things that I think about is that we all walk around with wounds, right? All of us. And as a black person in America, I don't even know many of the wounds that I may have on my body, in my mind, in my soul, because they've never were healed. Right? So they could be scabbed over and never healed. And so, and I think that imagery of Jesus and his wounds, do this in remembrance of me. I guess in my head, I'm picturing, is anyone remembering my wounds? So that when they encounter me, it is a space of grace. It is a space of mercy at times, right? But it's also a space where I'm not the objectification of something, but we are in partnership regarding the life that we've been called into. And so I think that imagery is extremely important to us because it makes it so that we all can connect to this idea of what is wounded and what can be healed, right? We can't be healed if we don't even understand we've been wounded.
Thank you for that. What you say reminds me of something your students, when I look at Stephanie and say it reminds me of something one of her students said, I'm talking about the experience in Washington, D.C. So the research is in 3 phases. We completed the first phase, where all the students, we went to the museum, and then over a course of a couple of conversations at a church and then at the hotel, we debriefed the day. Many of you are familiar with this, trauma studies, and trauma is becoming so popular today, but there's a book called The Body Keeps Score, The Body Keeps Count. And one of your students said to you when we were debriefing, Professor Boddie, if it's true that the body keeps score, the score is really high. And another one of her students asked, do we have permission to be angry? Because in the classroom, we don't get this. In the seminary, we're not afforded this permission without being stigmatized. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about what we experienced in DC.
It's the permission one that stuck out to me the most from their debrief. Their debriefs were raw, they were authentic, but the part that to me that just sank into the pit of my soul is, have I created spaces in the classroom where someone feels that they have to ask me permission to be? And I think that should trouble all of us. No one should ask permission, can I express an emotion that is a valid part of one's identity? And that linkage is to what, Dr. Gibson tries to pull out through the work that he does regarding the African American autobiographies, right? Is that this idea that somehow, the reason why Frederick is my favorite is because somehow he has agency outside of the actions of the slaveholders regarding permission. You had to ask permission for everything. But he sits outside of that. And I'm thinking to myself, that should not be outside. It should not be skewed, right? It should not be something that is a one. Everyone should feel like they can express their emotions. And so that means that we've done a disservice to the educational system regarding how students function, behave, and learn how to integrate it all. We're supposed to be building critical thinkers. That's what we're supposed to be building. But in fact, I'm not sure we're doing that, because he could not be critical of the experiences if he had to ask permission to be angry.
For the students, particularly that student that asked that question, what I later came to understand about the question that he was asking and also his experience was indeed the way you'd expressed that his understanding of theological education was that you are to come in and to learn the things that your professor wants you to learn and be able to bring them back to the professor, that he really didn't have any spiritual agency in this process. And so for me, it was troubling, as you say, because if part of this process is intellectual formation, but also spiritual formation, then we're not allowing that space for that to happen when we don't allow people to be fully human. Because one of the things that I appreciate from what you just expressed, Danjuma, about how we are to remember Christ's death is the fact that Christ died for us to reclaim our humanity. And so it was quite troubling to see the student wrestling and feeling that they needed to ask, is it okay for us to be angry, to express our anger? Fortunately, through the process of going through the museum and having the debrief, students did find their voices and they were able to express their feelings. We were fortunate. Not only did we have our time traveling during that weekend, because we flew into Dallas, we had 2 hours to make it back to Waco, Texas. And during that time, and since, I've talked to several students that have felt like this is the kind of experience that I want to have in seminary. Because not only did I get in touch with something inside of myself, but they also feel that now they have connections with other seminarians that they weren't able to have in the traditional classroom, and so that they're able to support one another as they go on this journey to really begin this soul repairing work.
Thank you for that. That's a good segue into the second question that we will respond to, and then we want to open it up if there are any questions or reactions from the audience. But in this second question, and it's a good segue off of what you just finished with, Stephanie, why are we teaching this class as an embodied experience as opposed to, no, you've heard that word a lot, not only here but elsewhere, an embodied experience. Why was it so important for us to do this as an embodied experience outside of the classroom, going to these various sites? I'll start with you this time, and then Rolanda.
I think it was important because it really helped the students see that we valued their feelings, we valued more than just their thoughts about these experiences, but that we really wanted them to have an opportunity to fully enter into the experience and to be able to think about the ways that racial violence and the lack of lament and the need for lament really has impacted them as a whole person. And so part of the way that violence and the lack of lament impacts us is physically. We hold that pain. You know, some of us may complain of neck pain very often when we're stressed out. We hold pain in our body. There's no coincidence that when we're sick, we call it a dis-ease. And so I think that in inviting the students into an experience like this, it really will help them to create these new, hopefully, healing memories as they engage in these experiences and begin to understand the complexities of the racial violent history that we have in this country, and that they can begin to heal from that process in a more holistic way than I think if we just gave them a set of readings that they took home with them, and then we came back and had 2-hour, 3-hour discussions. I think this immersion experience is really calling them, just like the student, it's calling them to enter into this experience more deeply than you might if it were a traditional classroom. And hopefully that they will come out of this experience not necessarily knowing more things, but being different people and having a different capacity for understanding what lament is and understanding the racial violence that we have in this country and being able to continue their own healing journeys.
Thank you for that, Rolanda.
We educate people through sterile stories. That's what we do. We edit them, we clean them up, we give them out. And the embodiment pushes that traditional way of learning out of consideration. Embodiment is, we're going to present you with truth, and you get to struggle in the truth. So, I mean, I've been to the museum multiple times now. I think I'm on either 4 or 5, right? The amount of times that I've been. And every time I go there, there's new discoveries. 1, because it's a museum, but 2, because my brain has to deconstruct what I've been taught through the sterile environments in which I've learned. So the embodiment places us not just physically in spaces, but it also allows us to have conversations with others who are outside of those traditional texts that we provide in our classrooms and readings. So Danjuma and I have had this conversation, so everybody comes to Buffalo next month. And one of the things that I struggle with is that the wound is still fresh, even though I didn't die. The wound is fresh. And I've only been to the Tops 1 time since May. That's it. I can't even bring myself to drive down the street. I can't do it. And I don't even know if I live a full mile from it. It used to be a store that I went into. There's no way I can go in there. And so our conversation has been about, do we take them to the Tops? And the psychotherapist is like, yes, we take them to the Tops. Right? The person who's like, but Danjuma, I don't know if I can do it. I just don't know if I can do it. So the embodiment is important because it's different from what you have learned in the past. We're not trying to reteach you what you learned. We're trying to allow you to learn something you never even knew you hadn't even learned before. So the embodiment is a necessary piece of this. And if we then link it to the fact that these are seminarians, these are future scholars, then that means that when you meet someone, you ultimately will always see Jesus. Because you will have experienced some sense of the wounds. And if you have experienced that, then every time you encounter somebody, you will see Jesus. So I just think that it is a critical piece. It is something that we just don't do. We teach people about human development without exposing them to human development. Okay? So I think it's just a critical piece to this learning that we're trying to invoke.
Thank you for that. So I'll respond to this question, why embodiment, and then we'll open it up to some conversation here. When I think about a model, an anthropological model, whether theological, anthropology, psychological, of what it means to be human, I think of 3 things. Sometimes I refer to it as a triangle of being or a pyramid of being, where we are all at the same time cognition, affect and emotion, and body. Now you'll notice I said cognition, I did not say intellect. Because intellect I understand as just how we make sense of something. While most people associate intellect with cognition, I argue that intellect is also body and affect. You can make sense of something out of your body as well as affect or emotion. For example, and I'm still working through a clinical picture of this, the way we train people in theological education. Your awareness of salvation, students are immersed in historical creeds and confessions, the Apostles' Creed, various doctrines, theologians, Barth, Calvin, Kuyper, whoever it may be, and the Christian identity is formed around knowledge of what these historical doctrines, creeds, and confessions, we measure them by that. I grew up in Chicago. There are a lot of seminaries in Chicago. I pastored a church for about 17 years on the south side of Chicago. If I could uplift us from here and take us there, I could point out many people whose knowledge or awareness of their salvation is not on historical creeds and confessions, but they will say, I know I am saved because the things that I used to do, God delivered me. You can be a seminary professor and still not be delivered. God delivered me from an addiction, no matter what you may think of the testimony. So that is a manifestation of intellect through the body. Or I know God has redeemed me because I used to hate so-and-so. I used to be bitter, but God took that away from me and gave me a new heart. In qualitative research, you take the testimony at face value. And so we are simply not just cognition. God can access us at any point. Hence, the word had to become flesh and dwell among men to perfect salvation. Because if the word, it has become flesh, otherwise the prophets could have done it. They couldn't meet the standard. So when I think of embodiment, I think of the story of Peter and Cornelius. God convicts Peter of his biases, as we all have biases, and tells Peter in this vision in Acts, don't call anything that I've made impure. Then Peter shows up at Cornelius' house. God already tells Cornelius he's coming. And so then Peter starts to put it together. But he still brings his bias to the house, right? Because when Cornelius opens the door, the first thing Peter says is, I'm a Jew and I'm really not supposed to be here. That's how we are. We think we are just, that's the kind of arrogance we all have. And while Peter is there and he's getting, Peter and Cornelius, they are getting an understanding of what is happening. Peter sees something. He sees the Holy Spirit poured out on people he thought were beyond God's reach. Just as the Holy Spirit had been poured out on Peter. And then how does that chapter end? What does Peter say? He says, how can we prevent these from being baptized, seeing that they have the Holy Spirit just as we have? Now, before Peter got there, his doctrine, the way he read it, the way he read the law, Peter, James, and John, those are the big three, the way they read it was that the Gentiles could not be baptized. It wasn't cognition that made Peter say they can be baptized just as we are. He saw something. He experienced something because the passage says he was astonished. Body and affect, and then it changed how he read the text. And then the next chapter, he goes back and he says, look what I found out. He didn't go back and say, let's re-exegete the text as we teach people to do in seminary. He experienced something, it astonished him, and then he understood the text in a different way. How much more could we be in the church if we became strangers again? Get out of our context of comfort, go and witness what God is doing, and the potential that that can change how we have understood what we have cognated as long as we've been. Does this make sense what I'm saying? I haven't fully flushed this out, clinically, psychologically, or theologically, but to answer the question, why the embodied experience, this is why we are so insistent that this is a turn that theological education has to take. Questions, comments, brilliant remarks? Anyone, reactions?
Emotions are always the ones that rule our thoughts. And we want to think it's the other way, but it's really our experience and how we handle our emotions. Our thoughts, our cognitions, our intellect is made to govern that and interpret it for us. But that's why it's faith about the heart, not the head.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say back to you, because one of the things that was eye-opening to me was that even though emotions, right, construct how we are in the world, we can also mute those emotions. And for me, on that trip, the group that pushed my heart were the Black men who cried. Because in society, we have whipped them so that emotions are not allowed and expressed. And so that validity around emotional availability isn't for everyone in this society. And I think this trip allows these young men, these young pastors, to see themselves in a different way because they are released from the emotions that they can never say in other places. So I think are we here to just project a certain disposition of what faith is, or are we going to allow people to be real in what their faith is to them? And I think that's the part that really is almost healing. I don't know about how it was for them, but it was healing for me because I said, I'm so glad that they had this time on this trip. I'm glad, I'm not glad that somebody is crying, but I am glad that he got to release. So, when we think about this emotional availability or freedom, I also have to push back that we need to be clear, right? And in certain spaces, you don't get that luxury.
Thank you for that. Yes. 1, 2, yes.
So you're reminding me of the work of Andrew Root in his book Christopractice. He argues that in seminaries, practical theology has basically boiled down to craft in the interest of pastoral practice. And he wants practical theology to become attention to the way people actually experience the presence of God in their lives, in the daily living. And this is what you're reminding me.
I like it. Absolutely. I have not heard of that book. What's the author again?
Andrew Root, he's a Lutheran guy.
Okay.
Christopraxis.
Okay. That's awesome. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about because you talk a lot about this experience you're bringing them through and giving them permission to do lament. Are you also teaching something about what is the practice of lament? Because I'm imagining from a theological sense, lament carries us through all these different things beyond the complaint to the trust, except for Psalm 88. And so I'm wondering, are you teaching them that whole thing, or just immersing them in an experience and seeing what happens? What are you asking them to actually do when they lament?
Well, there's a lot that you just said there. And I have heard lament taught the way. I have learned how you talk about it, how you see patterns in the Psalms. But I think in this, what we are doing, the learning is reciprocal. I think that is one way to understand what is happening in the text. One of the things that I discussed this morning is that lament is very cultural based, contextual based, in how people read the text, how they express it, how they do grief work. And the important theme in lament is not, in Dr. Gibson's perspective, is not necessarily a particular process or framework, but that you are not ignoring the lost pain. That's right. And I think that is what we do, and we've taught that as being faith and strength, right, to repress the pain. Right. This morning I suggested that joy and lament are not opposites, but that lament is a manifestation of joy. And so it's nothing that we should compartmentalize. Lament varies to, and the process of it varies to what's the loss it's responding to. A loss where someone, God forbid, loses a grandmother that's 95, 100 years old, that it can be very painful, but it also follows a normal course of events. The lament that parents are incurring in Uvalde, Texas, that's a lifelong lament, and we're not clear where it leads, where it ends, or a predetermined path that it should take. And so that's my reaction to some of the things that you are saying. I don't have an answer, but just a reaction.
And for me, because this is about Black bodies, right? I'm going to lament until Tyree isn't killed the next time. Right? I'm going to lament. So I think, because that's the part when I called Danjuma to have this conversation about this project, I was frustrated. I was legitimately frustrated. And it was because people wanted to move on. They were ready to move on. We had a lamentation worship the next day. We brought people in for a 3-hour prayer service. And then the next thing you heard was about when is the TOPS going to reopen? People died violently, intentionally. People died. And we were done with our lamenting, but we really weren't done. There's still victims, family victims, who say we're not done. And so for us as a church to think about it as a process that has these logical movements, that defeats the purpose of lament. You lament until you're done, because then you start to feel better, and then you can be hopeful, joyful of what is to come. But I can't be joyful when I have to play a video that tells people how to protect themselves from the police. I can't be joyful, right? I can't be joyful when I go into a community and the prices in the community are 3 times what they are in the wealthy community. I can't be joyful. And so I think that's the part about this project to me is how do we help seminarians have an understanding that Lamentations is present in our communities, which requires them to experience life differently. That's how we teach Lamentations.
And I would just briefly add to that, I believe one of the core responsibilities of pastoral leadership is to compel the community to lament, because we don't like it. It hurts. It brings us into contact with, whatever, it has precipitated the lament, whether that's evil, just the brokenness of life, tragedy. But what we are arguing and what our students are teaching us is that it is instructional. And how then do we mine it? Not glorify it, not gaze at it, but how do we mine it for what God is attempting to reveal of God's self? Yes.
So basically, if I'm understanding, you're setting up an understanding where lament is Christian. It is a Christ-like response. How are you experiencing resilience through lament? I mean, what have you noticed about how, what are the observations about how, one of the gifts of lament is that resilience is born. It changes us, it centers us on God. I mean, what are your students teaching you about resilience through lament?
I think part of that you'd have to ask us in June, because we haven't, we're really going to get to that when we get to Buffalo, New York, and then South Carolina, where the students are seeing how those communities are fostering resilience or not, or whatever they have. Again, this is qualitative research we are engaged in, and so we are open to being shocked.
But one of the things, so remember race and equity, my mind is always there. But one of the things that I push back on is who gets to define what resilience is. So, and I think that's one of the things why South Carolina was chosen, is because immediately after that massacre, the act of forgiveness was a part of the story. Lamentations wasn't allowed to be present, but the resilience was defined by the fact that that community talked about forgiveness immediately. And this is a pushback for when it comes to race, is that Black folks are asked all the time to step into spaces of forgiveness. Well, guess what? I don't want to forgive you when you lashing me, right? I don't want to forgive you when you don't give me that job because I earned it, but because my name is something different. So I think we have to be careful about these concepts, because they aren't fair to all. So when we're talking about deconstruction of something, we have to question ourselves, how are we defining it and who's defining it?
And you say that for a media that could care less about anything related to the faith. Immediately after what happened at Mother Emanuel, I mean, you had media across the board. Do you hate him? Mm-hmm. I mean, the bodies were probably still warm, and then the narrative went to immediately, how quickly can you forgive? Whatever that is, that's another topic. What does forgiveness look like is a question that I ask in practical theology. How do you prove it? How do you evidence it? Because I believe here in the U.S., we've made forgiveness an individual matter. Not communal, it's individual, and it's, when I tell you I have forgiven, then that means I have forgiven. And so there are just so many layers there, but the narrative to quell the anxiety of the country, we immediately turn to the forgiveness narrative. Yes.
Thank you all so much for doing this work and for diving into these questions, diving into the messiness of this conversation, of this work. I'm really this seminary, and I love the way that I was taught preaching at this seminary, but one of the things that I'm wrestling with is that, those of us who were trained in preaching at Calvin Seminary over the last, 10, 20 years or so, were taught to keep our eye out for those page 4 stories, which, when you were describing the stories, what did you say? You said curated, edited, retold, paraphrased, cleaned up, focused. And that's so often where we land in our preaching, right? Is we want to show the way that God's at work in the world, the transformative power of the Holy Spirit in people's lives. But there's a lot of resistance in my tradition to just giving people the microphone to share their testimony. Not just from the church who says oh, well, that might go on a little long, but from people who say, I can't tell my story, it's not cleaned up yet. My story isn't a testimony yet because it doesn't have a clear ending, right? It's not redemptive yet. I'm still in the mess. I'm still in the darkness. I'm still broken. I'm still looking for healing, and so I can't tell my story in church because it's not a good church story. And so I apologize that I'm going on long because I'm still wrestling with this a little bit. But I wonder from the three of you, if you have any advice for pastors and for people who are leading worship on ways that we can, you talk about Lamentation as pedagogy, and I love that because pedagogy is a process of teaching, of equipping, of training. And part of what Lamentation does is, like you said, it's not just something that we lament so that we can get over it. We lament and then we ask when can the grocery store open. Lament is a discipline that teaches us to find God in the mess and to see Christ in the humanity. And so what advice do you have for preachers and for worship leaders to teach our churches and to model for our churches how to be in the mess?
That's a great question. And I risk here giving a very, very simple answer that you may say, Dr. Gibb, you could have kept that. I would argue there is no faith community out there that does not struggle with lamentation. There's no faith community that's a pro that cannot learn. I am reminded of Jesus' instruction about putting new wine in old wineskin. And what's often overlooked is that Jesus is just as concerned about the old wineskin as he is about new wine. He said, if you do it prematurely, you'll break it. New wine is going to spill, and your old wineskin is destroyed. You do what you can. But at the same time, it's going to require courage. It's going to require pain. Nothing in this kind of work can be done courage-free and pain-free. But just as Christ is gentle with us, so my response is in all of that, and then to take a long view. Sometimes I share with my student, one of my favorite passages is when Paul says, one plants, one waters, but God gives the increase. That can represent 90 years. And a lot of us don't like that, to think that the work that I'm doing, I won't live to see the growth. And so I just invite you to consider those things as you are thinking about how to. You will have to answer those questions, but those themes of take a long view. Jesus loves the old wineskin as well as new wineskin and new wine. And rarely does God ever allow any one of us to plant water and see the increase, because it will foster arrogance in us.
I'm not a pastor. I'm just a good lay person. That's all I am, good layperson. I just took my class, actually, so I teach African American faith and social justice, and as a part of the course, there's a portion of embodiment. So we have to go to church, my churches, right? So Niagara is a Catholic Vincentian institution, and we go to my friends in the neighborhood and go to their churches. And so this past Monday in class, before we got started, I said, hey, let's just check in and see how was it for you. They have a paper that's due this weekend, and I'll see more thoroughly what they thought. But this is what they said. Dr. Ward, I've never been to a church where there was so much love. Another one said, I've never experienced that level of community. And because in that church experience was certainly love of God, but there was also this piece of messiness. You know, there was the Black History portion of the program where they talked about a person who didn't get their dues and acknowledgments regarding the fight for justice, right? There was, the sorrow about people passing, but the care and concern. And so as a pastor, I would ask the question, when do people leave your church? To hear about the lives of the people they don't know, right? We like what we like. We don't know what we don't like because we never experience it. And so, right, I think it's not page 4. It's not for the 4 walls, but it's the 4 corners of your community. Where are your congregation members getting out to see about the other? Right? We other people because we don't know them. That's why we other people.
I guess I would say, just to add, that it's also making time to get to know those people in your congregation, because oftentimes what we know of the people who sit on the pew with us is their sterile story. And so when something happens in their lives and maybe they don't show up for a few weeks, instead of us asking the question, how can we care for that person, we want to know, well, where have you been? And I'm not sure that that's the most compassionate way to respond to somebody who's been missing in action. Would we do that to a soldier? So I would say that in addition to getting outside of the church and getting to know the people we consider the other, is that we become more invested in getting to know each other and knowing the journey that we are on, because that journey is messy. And we're dealing with our own wounds. We're dealing with our own transition from the unholy complaint to the holy complaint. And how do we get there? And I just remember a story with a woman that was in my prayer group once. She came to me with something that sounded like a very reasonable complaint in her family situation. And I knew if she took it home to her husband the way she was sharing it with me, it would probably lead to a divorce. But it was something she needed to share. There was a way to share it. But at that point, she didn't know how to raise a holy complaint to God that would then allow her to raise her complaint to her husband. So again, I just say, without having those relationships and knowing each other, how are we even helping each other to learn how to lament and to raise a holy complaint?
I am very convicted by what you say, because in 17 years of pastoring, I have asked, where have you been, about 1 million times. And,
no, my grandfather taught me to say, when he sees people, he'd always say, my dear child, it's so wonderful to see you. We had a woman who would always come to church 5 minutes before it ended. like she didn't know when it started, and he would always say, "My dear child, it's so wonderful to see you."
Well, we are at time here at 3:58. Were you raising your hand for 2 minutes?
Okay, so I don't know if you're going to be able to answer it, so I'll talk fast. It sounds just that you're saying that there's a certain type of liminality to lament, that there is not an end to it, perhaps particularly with what we're talking about, but it acts similar to grief, like it just doesn't.
Not linear.
And it will come up at different times. So I guess I'm wondering if you are offering any rituals of lament with your people, not rituals that will end it, like you mentioned, okay, the next day, okay, we're done, let's move on, but rituals of liminality that will help them as they're continuing in this lamenting.
So to end it, I will, something similar I said this morning. It's not that lament doesn't end, it's varied. Lamenting for something, again, like the grandparent versus the loss of a child, totally two different paradigms. The ritual, I would put like this, as an example. In my client work, and even in the classroom, I argue, what's the purpose of lament? The purpose of if we don't engage in lamentation, if we don't engage in grief work, we run the risk of giving up on love. This is what I think Job does in the last chapter of Job. This is what I said this morning. A lot of commentaries say that he was faithful and God gave him back everything. I don't think God gave Job back anything. I think what we see there in that last chapter is Job taking a risk. Even after losing everything, I'll give it another shot. So rituals of loving again. I come from a tradition, a faith tradition, very conservative faith tradition, where evidence of faith was, can you praise God in the midst of your pain? And we inflict that on people a lot in funerals. Can you still praise God even though your heart is ripped out? This is Dr. Gibson. I don't think the task of faith in the midst of great tragedy is proving that you can praise God in the midst of pain. I think the greater task, can you give love another try after love has been taken from you? That's the exercise of faith, and I would think of rituals along the lines of how can we help people cultivate the courage to give it another shot, to love again. This may not fit, but sometimes, like after September 11th, I believe the way you fight terrorism is not more war, it is have more babies. Restore life. Loving again after you've lost, that's God's work. That is God's work. God bless you. We're over time, and I'm a Baptist preacher, so I can take you to 5 o'clock. God bless you.